The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, tucked between utility bills and a coupon for half-price dry cleaning. Grace Monroe nearly threw it away without opening it, assuming it was a mass-mailed flyer. But the envelope was thick, the script elegant, a wedding, her cousin Meredith, distant cousin, really, second or third. Grace couldn't remember the last time they had spoken, or if they ever had more than a passing conversation. At a family reunion over plastic cups of lemonade, she almost didn't RSVP. In fact, she had planned not to. But something in her, maybe guilt, maybe the aching loneliness that sometimes crept in on quiet Saturday nights, made her check yes and drop it in the mail. Now she stood just inside the entrance of the opulent Wexford Hall, blinking. Beneath the soft golden glow of chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a royal ballroom, the room glittered with crystal and laughter. Women floated past in silk and sequins, their heels clicking confidently on marble floors. Men stood in well-fitted suits with polished shoes and practiced smiles. Grace tugged at the sleeve of her pale blue dress, a vintage piece she'd found at a thrift store, and altered herself. It looked charming in her bedroom mirror. Here, it felt like a child's attempt to mimic a grown dash-up. She approached the check-in table where a young woman with a tight bun and tighter smile scanned a list. Name, Grace Monroe. The woman's eyes flicked over the clipboard. Table 11, she said, pointing vaguely to the back corner of the ballroom. Grace nodded, whispering a thank you that was lost in the swell of string music. Her heels made almost no sound as she walked past elegantly dressed guests sipping champagne and laughing like they had known each other forever. She avoided eye contact, clutching her small purse like a lifeline. Table 11 was behind a massive column and partly hidden by an oversized floral arrangement. Grace slipped into the nearest chair. No one looked up. The table was already partially filled, a couple clearly arguing in hushed tones, an older man engrossed in his phone, a woman snapping selfies and adjusting her lipstick between shots. No introductions, no smiles. Grace folded her napkin on her lap and glanced at the empty seat beside her. Of course, the corner table, the overflow, the people they didn't know where else to put. She reached for her water glass, willing her hands not to shake. Conversations at nearby tables floated around her like static. A new condo in Manhattan, a private safari in Kenya, the latest luxury SUV with built-in massage seats. Grace didn't belong here. Not in this world. Not tonight. She caught sight of the bride at the head table, radiant and glowing, surrounded by friends who looked like they stepped out of a bridal magazine. Meredith probably didn't even remember inviting her. Grace stared down at the menu card and sighed. She'd eat the salad, maybe the entree if it wasn't too awkward. But dessert, she'd definitely stay for dessert. Then she'd slip away quietly, alone, unnoticed. As always, the clink of cutlery and the hum of champagne-fueled conversation blurred into a dull roar. In Grace Monroe's ears, she smiled politely at no one in particular, cutting into her salad. Even though she wasn't hungry, a soft jazz band had begun to play near the dance floor, and couples were beginning to pair off in graceful rhythm. Her gaze wandered there for a moment, watching the way laughter came so easily to others, the way people touched like they'd never known awkwardness. Then she returned her attention to her plate. She speared a cherry tomato with unnecessary focus. That's when a chair beside her scraped softly against the floor. She glanced up. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair just long enough to brush over his ears, swept back as though he'd run his fingers through it instead of relying on a mirror. His tuxedo looked like it had been tailored for his frame by someone who understood art. But it wasn't just his appearance that made Grace blink. It was the quiet way he looked at her, like he wasn't just seeing a woman at an awkward table. In the corner of a wedding, he was noticing her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that made people pause mid-conversation. Without knowing why, Grace opened her mouth, but no sound came out for a heartbeat. Then she shook her head. "No, go ahead." He slid into the chair with unhurried grace, as if he had chosen this seat deliberately, not out of necessity. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't immediately reach for the bread basket. He turned toward her. "Curious, I'm Elias," he said. "Grace." She offered a small smile, immediately dropping her eyes to her plate. "Nice to meet you, Grace." His tone was gentle, not pitiful, not patronizing. She nodded, likewise. There was a pause, the kind that might have stretched into something uncomfortable, but Elias filled it. Not with bragging or shallow charm like most of the men she had overheard tonight, but with a question. "Do you know the bride or groom?" "Bride, distant cousin. I almost didn't come." He chuckled. "I'm best friends with the groom." He said the seating chart was cursed. "I didn't realize I'd been exiled to the forgotten realm of table 11. Grace laughed softly. "Before." She could stop herself. "There are worse places," she said, surprised by her own words. "True. For example, I just escaped a table where a man tried to convince me that crypto is a religion and that his Great Dane can predict stock prices." She laughed again, and this time it didn't feel polite. It felt real. Elias leaned in slightly. "So, Grace from the forgotten realm. What do you do when you're not surviving chaotic weddings?" "I'm a librarian," she said. "I work with children mostly. Story time, book fairs, things no one here would find particularly exciting." "Are you kidding?" Elias smiled. "That sounds like you create little magic worlds for people, and then teach them how to open the door and walk in." Her heart fluttered. She hadn't expected anyone to describe her job like that, especially not someone like him, someone who looked like he belonged on the cover of Forbes. And then, just as she started to relax, a tall, blonde woman in emerald green passed their table. She slowed, did a double take, then walked backward a step. "Elias." He looked up. "Vanessa, I didn't realize you were here." And here, her eyes flicked to Grace, taking her in like a piece of thrift store furniture at an auction. "Did you get demoted?" Elias's expression didn't change. "No. Just finally decided to sit somewhere real for a change." Vanessa's lips pursed. "Well, enjoy." She walked away in a cloud of perfume and self-importance. Grace stared down at her lap, her good mood shriveled. She knew that tone, that look, that unspoken suggestion that she didn't belong, that Elias was slumming. But then Elias turned back to her. "Sorry about that. She's a walking stereotype. Grew up thinking the world owed her champagne and compliments. You don't have to sit here." Grace said softly, "You probably have 100 other places you'd rather be." He studied her, and what he said next shifted something in her chest. "Right now, this is exactly where I want to be." There was no hint of flirtation in it, just sincerity. She couldn't breathe for a moment. Across the ballroom, the music slowed to something softer, deeper. Elias looked toward the dance floor, then back at her. "Would you dance with me?" "I'm not great at it," she said immediately, heart racing. "Good, neither am I," he replied with a smile. "But I think we'll manage just fine." She hesitated, but something in her whispered yes, not because she believed she belonged, not because she was suddenly confident, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had asked her, not out of politeness, not out of pity, but because they chose to. She placed her hand in his, and everything began to change. The dance floor shimmered under a constellation of fairy lights strung across the ceiling, like stars trapped in a ballroom. Grace's breath caught as Elias led her gently into the swell of music and motion. She felt exposed, like all eyes were on her. A woman in a pale blue dress that didn't quite belong. A man in a tuxedo who looked like he belonged. Everywhere. But Elias didn't seem to notice the whispers or the curious glances. He didn't guide her like a showpiece. He held her like someone who had waited a long time to hold something fragile and precious and wasn't in a hurry to let go. "You're shaking," he said quietly. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "I don't usually dance." "Then let's just sway," he said. "No choreography, just you and me." He was warm, present, and for the first time, Grace allowed herself to settle into the music. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about not looking away from the one person who was really looking at her. But as they moved, Grace couldn't shake the growing awareness that something about this was too good. Elias Carter was too polished, too observant, too intentional. A man like that didn't just stumble into her corner of the world. He didn't sit at forgotten tables with women no one else saw. Unless he had a reason, she wanted to believe it. Was chance, fate, magic. But her heart had been bruised too many times to believe in fairy tales without asking questions. When the song ended, applause rose around them, but Grace couldn't quite relax. She pulled back slightly. "I should get some air," she said, voice quieter than she intended. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll walk with you." They stepped out onto the garden terrace. The air was crisp, perfumed by blooming jasmine. Tiny lanterns lit the path, and laughter echoed faintly from inside. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm just—" She folded her arms over her chest. "Trying to understand why someone like you is talking to someone like me." Elias blinked. "What do you mean? You're clearly someone. People look at you like they know you or want something from you. And I'm just Grace Monroe, table 11. Library card carrying. Nothing special, Grace." He leaned against the stone railing. "You think that's what I see when I look at you?" She didn't answer. "I've sat at 100 tables filled with people who have everything and say nothing. People who talk but never mean it. People who pretend to know you when they only know your bank account. But tonight," he turned to face her fully, "I sat beside someone who wasn't performing, who told me about books and little kids and dreams that still matter. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning in noise." His words hit her like a wave. She swallowed hard, emotions warring in her chest. "I Googled you," she said suddenly. Elias didn't even flinch. "You're Elias Carter. You've been on the cover of Business Line. You helped launch that clean water tech company. You donated $10 million to rebuild schools in war zones." He said nothing. The silence stretched between them. "You're a billionaire." "I'm a man," he replied, standing on a balcony, asking a woman not to disappear behind labels. Grace looked away. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted one evening, just one, where I wasn't a headline or a brand. I wanted to be someone who made you laugh, who danced badly with you, who listened when you talked about your grandmother's garden and the way you name your favorite books like they're people." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. He noticed. He didn't comment. He just offered his handkerchief like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I've scared you," he said softly. "I don't know," she admitted. "You make me feel like I matter. And that scares me more than anything else." The moment hovered, a fragile, breathless tension. Then a voice called from the ballroom. "Elias, we need you for the group photo." Elias looked toward the door, then back at her. "Will you wait for me?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I need to think." He didn't argue. He only nodded, then handed her something from his pocket before turning to go. A small, folded note. When she opened it, it read, "If all you saw tonight was who I am, then I've failed. But if you saw who I was with you, then maybe, just maybe, we both found something real." Grace stood under the stars, fingers trembling around the paper. Inside, the music swelled again. But out here, something much deeper had begun. Something that couldn't be undone with titles or tuxedos. She had come to the wedding expecting to be invisible. Instead, she had been seen and maybe, just maybe, chosen. The garden lights glimmered like distant stars behind Grace as she stepped back inside the ballroom. She felt like she was walking between two versions of herself: the woman who had arrived earlier, invisible and uncertain, and the woman who had just been told she mattered by a man the world couldn't stop watching. But that second version still felt like a dream, fragile and temporary, like a flower pressed between the pages of someone else's story. The music pulsed louder now. The crowd had thickened. People were tipsy, more relaxed. Yet Grace couldn't shake the weight in her chest. She scanned the room. Elias stood near the center, surrounded by a group of men in tuxedos and women who looked like fashion editorials brought to life. He smiled for the camera, but it was a careful smile, measured, not the one he gave her on the terrace. As the flash popped, a tall woman in crimson stepped closer to him, slipping her arm through his like she belonged there. Grace didn't recognize her at first. Then she heard the name on someone's lips nearby. "Isn't that Alyssa Vale?" The tech heiress. Grace's stomach twisted. Alyssa Vale. She'd read about her in business magazines. Heiress to a global electronics empire, known for her icy confidence, billion-dollar investments, and a not-so-secret history with Elias Carter. Their bodies leaned together as they spoke, heads tilted just slightly too close. Alyssa laughed at something he said and pressed a manicured hand to his chest. He didn't push her away. Grace turned her eyes to the floor and walked past the dessert table without stopping. She found a quiet alcove near the coat check and slid down onto the velvet bench, suddenly breathless. What did she expect? That a man like Elias would sit beside her for a few hours and suddenly abandon the glittering world he came from, that he'd forget the models, the power brokers, the people who shared his altitude. She dug into her purse and pulled out the note again, smoothing the folds. If all you saw tonight was who I am, then I've failed. But if you saw who I was with you, then maybe, just maybe, we both found something real. The words had felt honest, but now they trembled under the weight of what she'd just seen. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace, she looked up. Meredith the bride stood in front of her in her gown, cheeks flushed with champagne and happiness. I've been looking for you. I wanted to thank you for coming. Grace forced a smile. It's a beautiful wedding. Meredith sat beside her, lowering her voice. Can I ask you something strange? Grace blinked. Okay. Did you and Elias know each other before tonight? No. Why? Because he's different tonight. Meredith glanced toward the crowd. He's usually so closed off, always polite, but cold, like his mind's in 5 places at once. But when I saw him talking to you at table 11, I saw something I've never seen from him before. He looked anchored. Grace's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. Meredith reached for her hand. Whatever that means to you. I just wanted to say I think you made an impression. And then, before Grace could gather a reply, a voice echoed through the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? It was the groom, speaking into a mic. Before we continue, I want to say a few words. Grace rose slowly, following the others into the main room. Elias now stood beside the groom, who was beaming. I've known this man for 15 years, the groom said, slapping Elias on the back. He's been my best friend, my business partner, and the guy who convinced me not to name my first startup Frostbite. After my ex, laughter rippled through the room. But what most people don't know is that Elias has one rule at weddings, the groom continued. He always avoids the front row. He sits in the back, low profile. Tonight was no different except one thing. He chose to sit at a table most people try to escape. The crowd chuckled. But here's the truth. He didn't sit there by accident. I asked him to. Grace's heart skipped. The groom looked at Elias, then back at the crowd. I told him that someone was coming tonight who reminded me of who I used to be. Before success and spotlight, I said, there's a woman you need to meet. She's quiet, but she sees people. She listens like it matters. And if you sit beside her, you might just see yourself again. Every eye turned. Grace's blood ran cold. I didn't say her name, the groom said, but from the look on his face now, I think he figured it out. Gasps rippled through the guests as people turned toward her. Grace froze. Elias stepped away from the groom and walked straight toward her. No hesitation, no fear. Just truth. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. He simply held out his hand. Grace stared at it, heart pounding. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a daydream. This was a man who had been surrounded by every option, and yet walked through them all to reach her. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. And the room, for a moment, felt like it was holding its breath. Then the music began. Again. And together, they walked back into the spotlight. Neither of them had expected he to be real, and she to be seen. The ballroom didn't feel the same anymore. Not to Grace. Not after hundreds of eyes had turned toward her. Not after Elias Carter, billionaire, visionary, the man who could command any room, had walked away from crystal chandeliers and legacy families just to hold her hand. It should have felt like a fairy tale, but fairy tales didn't come with whispers that crawled under your skin or with acts of disbelief wrapped in manicured smiles. As she walked beside Elias, the attention felt too sharp, the lighting too bright, and every whispered conversation sounded like it ended with her name. They moved past clusters of people who smiled too tightly, who tilted their heads like they were trying to figure out if this was a stunt, a joke, or some temporary thrill Elias would abandon by morning. But he didn't flinch. he didn't let go. If anything, his grip on her hand grew firmer, steadier. He guided her to the edge of the dance floor where the music played low, romantic, slow. Then he looked at her not like a man, asking her to perform, but like a man who needed her to ground him. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, but it wasn't the truth. "I don't think I've ever been so visible," she admitted, voice trembling. "It's not a feeling I'm used to. You're not invisible anymore," he said gently. "And that might be hard for them to accept, but you don't owe them comfort. You just have to be real." She stared into his green eyes, searching for doubt, but all she found was quiet honesty. And something deeper, something rare. So she danced with him, not because she wanted to prove anything, not to perform, but because her body wanted to remember what it felt like to be wanted without condition. The music wrapped around them like silk. Her head rested lightly on his shoulder, and the room, for a few precious moments, faded, until it didn't, because someone shattered the quiet with a voice too loud, too pointed, too practiced in being heard. "So this is the girl?" Grace felt Elias stiffen. He turned slightly, shielding her from the interruption, but she twisted to look anyway. A woman in a black gown, sharp-featured and elegant, stood just a few steps away. Her hair was in a perfect twist, her lips painted red with intent. "Vanessa." She stepped forward, glass of champagne in hand, her expression unreadable. "You know, Elias," she said, voice cool as glass, "we were all wondering what your angle was. But now it makes sense. The whole man of the people image. Very relatable, very media-friendly." "I'm not playing to the media," Elias said coldly. "And this isn't your conversation." Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Is that what you told Chloe, or Natalie, or every other woman you paraded around for 2 weeks until they stopped feeling like charity work?" Grace inhaled sharply. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said, turning to her, voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You didn't know about them, did you? How he finds these refreshingly normal women, tells them they're different, then moves on when the press has their perfect picture. That's enough," Elias growled. But Grace had already stepped back. "Is that true?" she asked, softly, barely able to hear herself over the ringing in her ears. "No," he said instantly. "She's twisting things. I never." Vanessa cut in again, cruel and calculated. "Sweetheart, you think you're the first girl he sat beside at the loser table. You were handpicked. You were a talking point before you even arrived." Elias's fists clenched, his voice low and fierce. "That's not how it happened." Grace's mind was spinning. She remembered the groom's speech. "I asked him to sit with someone special." But what if Vanessa was right? What if it was all just some orchestrated image rehab? Elias, the reclusive billionaire, seen with a woman the world wouldn't expect. A story that looked like love, but felt like marketing. She pulled her hand from his slowly, her chest hollow. "I need to go," she whispered. "Grace, please, I need to think." He stepped toward her. "Don't let her poison what we've built. You know me, you do." "I thought I did." And before he could say anything else, Grace turned and walked away, past the stairs, past the murmurs, out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. The valet tried to ask her something. She didn't hear him. She kept walking, the hem of her dress gathering dew as she cut across the lawn toward the street. She pulled out her phone, called a ride, and stood there under a lonely tree, barely breathing. Elias didn't follow. Not right away, but 20 minutes later. As her car arrived and she opened the door, her phone vibrated. One new message from Elias. She opened it. "I never needed the world to believe in me, but I need you to. I'll wait, for as long as it takes. Just don't disappear." Her driver looked at her through the mirror. "You good?" Grace nodded. But she wasn't. She was terrified, because somewhere between sitting alone at table 11 and dancing in the arms of the most unreachable man in the city, she had started to believe. And now that belief was breaking. She wasn't sure if her heart would survive what came next. 3 days passed. 3 slow, aching days. Grace Monroe returned to her small apartment above the bakery on Pine Street, the one that always smelled like cinnamon and rain in the mornings. She went to work each day at the library like nothing had changed, like her heart hadn't shattered in a silk ballroom beneath a chandelier. That cost more than her college tuition. She smiled at children during story time. She checked an overdue. Books, she reshelved volumes no one had touched in years. But inside, she was unraveling. Her phone buzzed every morning, a quiet, steady rhythm. Messages from Elias, never more than one each day, never demanding, just waiting. Still thinking of you. I know what it looked like. I just wish I could show you what it was. You made me believe in something real, Grace. I won't let you be a footnote. She never replied, because she didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that your heart wants to believe them, but your history won't let you? How do you explain the weight of years spent being overlooked, dismissed, or used, and how that makes trusting even the kindest hands feel like stepping into fire? On the fourth day, the library was quieter than usual. A soft drizzle tapped at the tall windows, and Grace stood by the circulation desk staring out at the gray street below. She hadn't eaten. Her chest was tight, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a librarian. She felt like a ghost, a girl who had touched something brilliant and then watched it vanish. That's when Lily, her co-worker and best friend since college, walked in holding a paper bag. "You're going to eat this muffin," Lily said without ceremony, "or I'll." Personally read Goodnight Moon to the next toddler group in a Scottish accent. Grace blinked. "I'm not hungry. You're heartbroken," Lily said, setting the bag down. "There's a difference. I'm not. Don't lie to the girl who caught you crying in the fiction section yesterday." Grace slumped into her chair. "I don't know how to process any of it," she whispered. "He was so real with me, and then that woman just dismantled everything. What if I was just another narrative for him? Did he feel like a narrative?" Lily asked gently. Grace shook her head. "No. He felt like the first person who ever saw me and didn't want to fix me or use me or ignore me. But that's what scares me most." Lily leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time you find out which version is real, the story you've built in your head, or the man who keeps texting you every day even though you won't answer." Before Grace could respond, the library doors creaked open and everything stilled. Elias Carter stepped inside, holding an umbrella in one hand and something else in the other. The room shrank. He looked different, tired, hollow-eyed, but still Elias, still the man who had danced with her like she was the only melody in a noisy world. Lily stood slowly. "I'll just go check on the non-fiction section." She disappeared before Grace could stop her. Elias walked up to the desk and didn't speak for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You never answered my last message." "I didn't know how," Grace replied, her throat dry. "I figured." He said softly, "That's why I came instead." He set something on the counter. It was a leather-bound book. She stared at it, the title engraved in gold, "The Garden Library." Her favorite story, the one she'd told him about on their first night, the one her grandmother used to read to her. But this wasn't just a copy. It was hers. She opened the cover. Inside was her name written in her grandmother's hand, Grace Elizabeth Monroe. Her breath caught. "How did you?" "I found it," Elias said. "The original. Your grandmother had donated it to a charity auction years ago. It took 3 phone calls, 1 private collector, and a very persistent bookseller in Oregon. But I got it." Grace was speechless. "I wanted to remind you of who you were before I met you," he said, "so you could decide if I still fit in that world." She clutched the book to her chest. "I believed in you, Grace," Elias whispered, "long before you believed in yourself." "But Vanessa," he nodded, "she was telling the version of me that existed before I met you, and I let her because I didn't care what anyone thought. I never needed to correct the story until you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I have spent years sitting at the most important tables in the world," he said, his voice cracking. "But the only table I remember now is table 11. With you." Grace's hand trembled. "I'm scared." "Me too," he said. "But I would rather be scared with you than safe without you." And then, softly, he added, "Don't let someone else's bitterness rob you of something beautiful. Don't let her write our ending." Grace looked down at the book in her arms, then up into the eyes of the man who had handed her the most unexpected chapter of her life. "I'm not disappearing," she said at last. Elias smiled, slow and disbelieving. "You mean that?" "I want to see what comes next," she said. But I need it to be real. It already is, he whispered. They didn't kiss, not yet. That would come later. But when he took her hand again, not in a ballroom, but in a library under flickering, fluorescent lights and the soft hum of rain, it felt more magical than any dance. And in that small, quiet space, their story began again. The following weeks moved like chapters in a story neither of them dared to believe was real. But both were determined to write with honesty. Grace Monroe, who had once curled into herself at weddings and lived in second-hand dresses and paperbacks, now found herself navigating a world that gleamed with polished marble, fast cars, and men in suits who nodded like stock prices depended on their approval. And Elias Carter, once the untouchable man in the headlines, master of the boardroom and ghost at the galas, was beginning to taste what it meant to be human again. But nothing about their path was smooth, and nothing about loving each other was safe. Their first dinner out together after the library wasn't in some velvet-draped restaurant with champagne on ice. It was at a quiet food truck parked beneath an overpass, where Elias ordered tacos and Grace laughed when he spilled salsa on his cuff. I don't think billionaires are supposed to eat sitting on curbs, she teased. Elias grinned. I don't think billionaires are supposed to feel this free either. And for a moment, everything felt simple. Until it wasn't. The first article dropped 3 days later. A gossip piece. Elias Carter's new flame, a librarian from the wrong side of the city. They used an unflattering picture of Grace from a charity event where she had stood quietly in the background wearing a borrowed dress. The comments were worse. This has to be a PR stunt. She looks like a schoolmarm. Poor thing. She'll be gone in a month. Grace had stared at the screen in silence. Elias had read them too. Jaw clenched, fingers white around his phone. I should have protected you from this, he muttered. No, Grace said, her voice firm despite the ache. You shouldn't have to. This isn't your fault. This is their problem. But that didn't make it easier. Then came the investors. Elias was cornered in a meeting by Richard Vail, his senior partner, also Vanessa's father. We need to talk about the image you're building, Richard said, his tone coated in expensive concern. This woman, this Grace, is creating confusion in our public narrative. You're a face of innovation, not a charity campaign. Elias didn't flinch. She's not a campaign. She's my life. Richard's jaw twitched. And if your life costs us $30 million in investor confidence, are you prepared for that? I'm prepared to lose everything, Elias said evenly, except her. The room fell silent. That night, he told Grace. They sat in her tiny apartment, legs tangled on her couch, the scent of lavender candles in the air. Grace had been reading a children's manuscript out loud to him, giggling at the clumsy dragon character. But when he told her what Richard had said, her smile faded. You can't lose your empire for me, she said softly. Not because of me. I'm not, Elias replied. I'm choosing a new one. One that doesn't depend on people who think love is a liability. She looked at him, eyes wide. I want you to know something, Grace, he continued. When I first sat down at table 11, I thought I was doing a favor for a friend. I thought I'd check a box and get back to my corner of the world. But then I met you. He took her hands in his. You made me remember why I built any of this in the first place. So I could choose who I am, not who they expect me to be. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I'm not perfect, she whispered. I still get nervous around your friends. I still second-guess myself. I don't always feel like I belong. Elias leaned in and kissed her forehead. That's okay, he murmured, because I feel more like myself with you than I do in any boardroom or ballroom. But just as they began to breathe again, a storm was building. A major investor backed by Richard pulled out of a deal the next day. Stock value dipped. Reporters camped outside Elias's headquarters. Rumors swirled that his new distraction was costing his empire its edge. And then it happened. An anonymous email leaked. Subject line, she's not who she says she is. It included a blurry photo of Grace crying outside the wedding venue. Weeks ago. The caption read, this is the woman tearing down Carter Enterprises. The image went viral. Grace found out not from Elias but from Lily, who shoved her phone into Grace's hands at the library. You need to see this. Grace read every word, every headline, Every cruel comment. Her stomach dropped. Her past, her insecurity, her most fragile moment. It had been stolen and turned into proof she didn't belong. She ran. She didn't call Elias. She didn't go home. She went to the one place that had always made her feel small enough to disappear, the empty garden behind the library, where she used to sit alone during lunch in high school. And there, under a half-dead willow tree, Grace wept. Because love, no matter how powerful, sometimes still feels too fragile to survive the weight of the world watching. And somewhere in a corner office, Elias Carter stared at his phone, at the photo, at the war brewing outside his glass tower, and whispered, "I'm not losing her, not this time." Then he stood and walked away from the empire he built, straight into the fire. For her, the boardroom was cold more than usual. Elias Carter stood at the far end of the glass-walled chamber, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a painting he no longer cared to admire. Every man and woman at the conference table wore the same expression, expectant, calculating. And somewhere beneath that, quietly enraged. They weren't used to being summoned, and they definitely weren't used to being challenged. Richard Vale sat closest to Elias, leaning back in his chair like a man who believed he'd already won. His silver cufflinks glinted under the recessed lighting. "So," Richard said, breaking the silence, "you've brought us here to explain why our company has lost 3 high-profile investors in 48 hours over a romantic entanglement." Elias's jaw was tight, but his voice was calm. "I brought you here," he said, "because I'm taking back control of what I built." A murmur passed through the room. "I've watched you manipulate the narrative, Richard. Leak photos. Feed the media lies about the woman I love. You took something sacred and turned it into PR poison. You think I'll fold because numbers dipped?" He paused. "I won't. You're emotional." Richard replied smoothly, "And I understand. But your decisions are putting the company at risk." "No," Elias said, "you're putting it at risk by thinking this empire stands on perception instead of purpose." One of the other board members spoke, voice uncertain. "Elias, you've always been a strategic thinker. We're asking you to consider the larger consequences. She's a librarian, not one of us." "That's the problem," Elias snapped, fire breaking through his composure. "You think love is a weakness because it can't be monetized, because it doesn't wear couture or carry the right last name." He stepped forward, planting both hands on the table. "You want my resignation?" he said. "Fine." Gasps, silence. Elias continued, his voice steady. "I'm not interested in building towers anymore. I'm interested in building truth. I came into this world because I believed I could create something better. But if protecting Grace means walking away from everything with my name on it, I'll do it gladly." Richard scoffed. "You'll destroy yourself for a girl you met at a wedding?" "No," Elias said. "I'll become myself, for the woman who helped me remember who I used to be." Then he reached into his jacket, placed a thick folder on the table, and slid it toward Richard. "My exit terms, effective immediately. I've already signed." With that, Elias turned and walked out past the suits, the betrayal, and the empire that had once defined him, across the city. Grace sat in the garden behind the library, her hands curled around a cup of coffee Lily had quietly left beside her. She hadn't spoken in hours. The image of that photo, her vulnerable, tear-streaked face exposed to the world, played on a loop in her mind. The comments, the viral reactions, the people who called her pathetic, delusional, disposable. She'd always told herself she was fine being unseen, but the truth was, being mocked for daring to be seen hurt more than invisibility ever had. Her phone buzzed. It was Lily. "Check the news, now." Grace frowned, hesitated, then opened her browser, and there it was. Breaking. Elias Carter steps down from Carter Enterprises. I'd rather lose the world than lose her. Below the headline was a video. Press conference. Elias standing on the marble steps of the Carter Tower. Cameras flashing. Reporters shouting. "I built Carter Enterprises to change the world," he was saying, but somewhere along the way, I let it change me instead. I let fear make me cautious. I let control make me cold. But last month, I met a woman at a wedding I didn't even want to attend. A woman who sat alone at a table no one noticed except me. And she didn't see a CEO. She saw a man. I forgot how much I needed that. Grace's breath hitched. I didn't fall in love with her because she was different. I fell because with her, I was different. More real, more honest. She reminded me that power without heart is just vanity, and love without courage is just regret. He looked directly into the camera. Grace Monroe, if you're watching this, I'm done letting other people define my worth, or yours. I walked away from everything but the truth, and the truth is this: I love you, and I want you to. Come home. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks. Her coffee cup fell to the bench as her hands began to shake. Her phone rang, not a message, a call. His name lit up the screen. She answered on the first ring. Grace, his voice cracked on her name. You left everything, she whispered. I left nothing, he said. I kept the only thing that matters, you. There was silence, but not empty silence. It was full of choice, of love, of breathless truth. And then Grace whispered the words she had been too afraid to believe. Come find me. An hour later, a single black car pulled up outside the library. Elias stepped out, not in a suit, not in polished leather, but in jeans and a worn jacket, eyes red, heart open. Grace met him beneath the old willow. He didn't speak. He just fell to his knees, and for a long, wordless moment, they stayed like that to people who had broken through every expectation and lie in fear just to find each other. Then he looked up and took her hands. I didn't come here to win you, he whispered. I came to deserve you. Grace smiled through her tears. You already do. And in the hush of that forgotten garden, where stories used to feel too small to matter, a new story began. Rain fell softly over the city that night, not in sheets, but in the kind of gentle drizzle that felt like the sky was whispering. The library behind them had long since closed, but Grace and Elias remained beneath the willow tree, sheltering from the world with only each other for protection. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become sacred. After all the noise, all the doubt, all the headlines and betrayals and cruel speculation, the quiet was a gift. But peace, Grace had learned, was fragile, and the world wasn't done testing them. The next morning brought a storm neither of them expected. It began with a phone call. Elias had barely finished brewing coffee in Grace's tiny apartment when his phone lit up with a number he hadn't seen in years. Hello? A voice he knew too well answered, tight and trembling. It's your mother. He froze. Grace looked up from the couch, sensing the change in him. She's in New York, the voice said. She saw the press conference. She wants to see you. He hung up without answering. His hand shook as he set the phone down. I didn't think she even knew how to find me, Elias muttered, more to himself than to her. Your mother? Grace asked gently. Elias sat beside her, rubbing his hands together like he could scrape the past off his skin. She left when I was 17, he said. Walked out in the middle of the night. No warning, just a note. Said she couldn't live in my father's world anymore. Too cold. Too perfect. Grace reached for his hand. I didn't realize until later that I'd inherited more from her than I thought. Elias continued. The need to vanish, the fear of being seen. He looked at her. You helped me stop running, Grace. But now, the past is knocking. Grace didn't flinch. Then answer the door, she said. But I'm not letting go of your hand. That afternoon, they met at a small cafe on the Upper East Side, the place Elias's mother had requested. Elias hadn't been there in over a decade, but the moment they stepped in, the scent of chamomile tea and warm bread brought back memories so vivid he almost staggered. She was already waiting. Tall, elegant, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, and a face that wore time like a crown. She rose slowly, her eyes not leaving Elias for a second. You cut your hair, she said, voice trembling. You stopped sending postcards, Elias replied. A pause, then she looked at Grace. You're the one who changed him. Grace started to speak, but the woman held up her hand. Thank you, she said simply. And then she sat. The conversation was long and jagged, like smoothing the edges of broken glass. His mother spoke of regret, of guilt that hardened into silence, of 1,000 moments missed because pride wouldn't allow the first word to be spoken. I saw you on television, she whispered at one point. standing on those steps like your father used to. But your words, Elias, they were his opposite. And that's how I knew. You'd become something entirely your own. Grace listened silently. She watched Elias watched his walls crack and fall and rebuild themselves in new shapes. He was still her Elias, but now she was seeing him in a light she hadn't before. He wasn't just a man who had turned away from power. He was a boy who had been left behind, and a man who had chosen love anyway. By the time they stepped out of the cafe, the sun was beginning to pierce the clouds. Elias turned to Grace, his expression unreadable. "I think I needed that more than I realized," he said. She needed it too. Grace replied, "Sometimes we all do, even the ones who left." They walked in silence for a while. The city no longer seemed to buzz around them. It pulsed in rhythm, with something inside them both. When they arrived back at the apartment, there was a package waiting on the doorstep. A thick envelope, no return address. Grace opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, typed, no name, no signature. But the message was sharp and deliberate. "You've ruined him. You'll never be one of us. Take the money inside and disappear before you destroy everything he built." A check was folded inside. $2 million. Grace stared at it, her hands shaking. Elias reached over her shoulder. His face darkened. "I'll trace it," he said. "Find out who sent it." "I swear." "No," Grace interrupted, fire burning behind her eyes now. "We don't run from shadows anymore." She pulled the check from the envelope, tore it into pieces, and let the fragments scatter across the stairwell like confetti for a war she refused to lose. "I'm not for sale," she whispered. Elias pulled her into his arms. "Then we fight together, and somewhere in a penthouse or a corner office or the backroom of a private club." Someone realized their plan had failed, because Grace Monroe wasn't some silent girl in a second-hand dress anymore. She was the center of the storm. And Elias Carter, former billionaire, current truth seeker, was standing in it beside her. Together, they didn't just survive, they shattered expectations. And the world was finally watching for all the right reasons. The night of the gala arrived like the final chapter of a book no one believed would ever be written. It was the Carter Foundation's largest annual event, a legacy gala established by Elias's father Dago. Every year, it attracted the city's most powerful industry tycoons, politicians, media giants. It was where reputations were minted or buried, where the future of business, philanthropy, and society converged in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. This year, everyone expected it to be different, because Elias Carter was returning not as a CEO, not as a figurehead, but as something no one had seen before, a man who had walked away from it all. And tonight, he was bringing the woman he walked toward. Grace stood in front of her bedroom mirror, breath caught in her chest. The dress was unlike anything she had ever worn, midnight velvet, soft as a sigh, with a neckline that hinted at courage and elegance woven together. It had arrived anonymously 2 days ago, accompanied only by a handwritten card. "No one will see the dress. They'll be too busy looking at you." Ash smoothed her hair, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what tonight meant, what they were about to face. When the car arrived, Elias stood waiting in a black tailored suit, no tie, no artifice, just the man she had come to love, stripped of the world's expectations and still impossibly striking. "You're sure?" she asked as they drove past the glittering cityscape. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They arrived to flashing lights, and a red carpet stretched across the marble steps of the Crown Pavilion. Security guided them in. And then everything stopped. Conversations, camera shutters, glasses half raised in mid-toast. Because Grace Monroe, librarian, daughter of a teacher and a steelworker, with ink-stained hands and a quiet fire in her eyes, was walking into the lion's den on the arm of a man who had once ruled it. They moved as one, calm, composed, but inside, Grace's pulse raced like a symphony. People turned, whispers slithered. A group of executives muttered behind fluted glasses, "She's still here. She must be smarter than she looks. I give it a month." But Grace kept walking. Elias led her toward the grand staircase. He paused halfway up, nodded to the staff beside the podium, and without warning, the music stopped. A spotlight cut through the room, He turned to the crowd, microphone in hand. "I wasn't supposed to speak tonight," he began, voice calm, but unshakably strong. "In fact, some of you probably wish I hadn't shown up at all." Light laughter rippled through the crowd, thin, forced. "I left this world because I got tired of pretending," he continued. "Tired of measuring worth by wealth. Tired of believing legacy was more important than truth. And tired of wearing masks to every conversation." He looked toward Grace. "Then I met someone. A woman who never asked me for anything but honesty. A woman who never wanted my world. Just me. And for the first time in my life, that was enough." Gasps, murmurs, someone in the back snapped a photo. "Many of you wrote her off the second she walked in tonight," Elias said, sweeping his gaze over the room, "because she didn't come from your boardrooms or your parties or your bloodlines." He paused. "But Grace Monroe is the bravest person in this room." Now the silence was different, not cold riveted, because while you hid behind pedigrees and press releases, she stood in front of the entire world and refused to be bought, belittled, or broken. And I'm here to say she is not leaving. Cameras clicked, guests froze, and Grace, she stood there beneath that light like she belonged, like she had all along. Then Elias took a breath, pulled a small box from his pocket, and dropped to one knee. Gasps turned into shouts. Phones rose, but for Grace, the room vanished. "I don't have a company anymore," Elias said, "but I have a life, and I want to build it with you. Every ordinary morning, every terrifying risk, every chapter we write together. Will you marry me, Grace Monroe?" Tears blurred her vision. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. Double quotes, yes. Applause erupted. Not polite, not tentative. Thunderous. They didn't stay long after that. They didn't need to, because they had done what no one believed they could. They had walked into the lion's den and tamed it, not by roaring louder, but by standing taller. Weeks passed. Articles shifted from gossip to admiration. Billionaire turned bookstore partner. The love story that made the city believe again. Grace and Elias opened a new community space together, part library, part children's center, part sanctuary for anyone who ever felt too small to matter. They called it Table 11, because sometimes the most powerful stories begin in the forgotten corners of the room. Where do people choose to see each other, and everything changes. Forever.